you've been watching just about any form of media over the last couple of weeks, you know that there's been and we prayed for the Synod here in our Prayers of the Faithful, for the Synod of Bishops that's being held in Rome. It just concluded today. It will close formally tomorrow with Mass in St. Peter's Square, and also with the beatification of Pope Paul VI. But it's been a very dramatic 2 weeks. But I'm not going to talk about that. Maybe we can find some other opportunity to talk about the implications of this synod, the year that is to come, as we're all asked to reflect on what the bishops talked about. And then there's going to be another synod next October to bring everything together. So probably as a parish it would be good for us to find a way to talk more about it. But what I want to do tonight is reflect on the readings that we just heard in light of a homily that Pope Francis gave 2 weeks ago, just before he opened this Synod of Bishops. And clearly, the Synod was on his mind and how it was going to proceed. And in this homily that he gave, he talked about our God as being a God of surprises. And he kept using that phrase over and over and over again throughout the homily. Our God is a God of surprises. Are we still surprised by God in our lives? And as he talked about this, he said, you know, when all of these religious authorities that we've been hearing about in the gospel, the elders, the high priests, the Pharisees, the Herodians, all of these really faithful Jewish religious leaders, whenever they would ask Jesus for some sort of proof or some kind of sign, the Holy Father says, why were they doing that when the sign was right in front of them? Christ himself. And he said the reason that these leaders had trouble recognizing Christ is that they had allowed themselves to become closed off. They had created a system of laws, a system of theology, a system of religion that was completely self-contained. And because of that, God no longer surprised them. And because of that, they needed proof that Christ was who he said he was. Closed off. We see a good example of this kind of thing in the first reading. As Father Jim mentioned last week at this Mass, he mentioned that Cyrus, who we heard about in the first reading, was not a Jew. He was a Persian. He was the king of the Persians. And in this passage from Isaiah, we hear God talking to Cyrus and saying, I will take you by the hand. You are my anointed one to save Israel. In fact, the Hebrew word used would have been Mashiach, Messiah. You are a Messiah, an anointed of God, even though you're not Jewish. In fact, later we hear, you don't even know I exist. But I am using you to save my people. I will arm you to protect my people. God doesn't exist just in a box. And what Isaiah was reminding the people was just that. There are people who are part of God's plan, whether or not they're in our little group or not. The second thing the Holy Father talks about is he said that these religious leaders also felt that they were already arrived. They were already in place. They forgot that they were on a journey with God, that they were on a journey toward God. And they forgot that. They had already arrived. And he said because of that, they were blind. They were not able to see this God of surprises. Well, we see that a bit in the gospel. Again, we see this group of leaders, the Pharisees and the Herodians, and they're working together, plotting against Christ. The Pharisees, because they wanted to see if Jesus was a real Jew. Would he follow all the laws? They already knew he didn't. He ate with prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners. They already knew that. They were trying to get him to maybe admit to it. Because if Jesus says, pay the tax, well then he wouldn't be a good Jew. Because he would be supporting the Roman system. The Herodians, if you look at the name, Herod, they supported the system. They supported King Herod and the Roman system. So if Christ said, don't pay the tax, they would have had him there. Because then he would have been fomenting rebellion and insurrection. So really, he was pinned. How do you answer this? They were right. They had the answer. They were there to trap Jesus. And Jesus reminds them of something. And he says, give me the coin that's used for the tax. Whose image is on this and whose inscription? Well, you know, the answer, Caesar got the answer that he wanted. But it begs the other question. Whose inscription is God's? He says, render to God, repay to God what is God's, while you also repay to Caesar what is Caesar's. When we are baptized, we are sealed with God's seal. That's why the anointing takes place. That's what happens at a baptism. We are sealed for God. We are on a constant, lifelong journey toward God. The Holy Father says, how are we doing today? Do we find ourselves closed off? Are we stuck in one place? Do we feel we've always got all the answers and nobody outside our group can ever tell us anything? We've got it all. Or do we remain open to a God who is always going to surprise us? Do we remember that we're on a journey? Or are we stuck in the mud? Are we stuck in place, not going anywhere toward God? I think that's what these readings help us to understand tonight. Our God is a God of constant surprises along the journey back to Him. We need to be open, not closed, to that journey. We need to constantly be on journey. Where were we yesterday is not where we are today, and it's not where we're called to be tomorrow. Whose image is on the coin of your life, and whose inscription?